Hey guys, today we're here to go over the Vanquish V2 Hurtz dig. Now, if you're not familiar with what a dig is a mechanism that attaches to the backside of an axial 3-gear style transmission, like you find in the SCX-10, the SCX-10-2 ready to run, as well as some of the legacy models like the AX-10 Scorpion. Now, that mechanism allows you to disconnect power to the rear axle, and you can choose to either let that rear axle freewheel or lock it into position so that it holds the vehicle. The benefit to this is that you can lock the rear tires, turn sharp, and apply power to the front end, and it will perform a very tight turn, a tighter turn than you could ever do with all four wheels pushing you. The other benefit is that you can disconnect that rear axle, but still allow it to freewheel. That freewheel allows you to let those front tires work and try and get a good bite on like a vertical ledge. Once it's got a good bite and the vehicle is starting to move upwards, you can then re-engage four-wheel drive, and it'll allow you to propel the whole vehicle up a ledge that you previously would not have been able to do with four-wheel drive. If you would have attempted that same maneuver in four-wheel drive, those rear wheels will oftentimes want to bite, but rather than pushing the vehicle up the ledge, it may want to flip it over backwards. This is something that you've probably seen quite a bit if you've done any technical rock crawling. Now, if you are familiar with the dig and you are familiar with the Vanquish dig, the V2 is an updated version from the very first iteration that was released several years ago. The new version is updated to all chromoly parts on the inside of the dig, and the rear output of the dig is now bearing supported. One of the other updates that was done is that now the front and rear outputs that come with the dig are now a through pin style design, like the updated transmissions that come in most of the Axial products now. The entire dig mechanism is operated by an additional servo. So to control the dig, you will need a radio that has an extra auxiliary channel and that has programmable endpoints. It's very important that you'll be able to set the endpoints of the channel to control this dig, because you need to make sure that you're not overextending the servo either past the limits or too short and not getting full engagement of the drive pieces inside of the dig. The dig does come with the servo mount, and this is built for a normal full-size 1/10 scale servo. So most servos should do just fine. You don't need an overly strong servo, especially with properly set endpoints. As a general rule, I'd look for a servo with 120 ounce-inches of power or more. That'll make sure that you can disengage that servo from the locked rear position and get it all the way into four-wheel drive without any issues. For my installation today, I'm going to be using a Futaba BLS 471 SV. That servo's got a decent amount of power, but it's very fast. I like the fast shifting just so that I can get from lock to four-wheel drive as fast as possible. That's just a personal preference, but by no means do you need a high-end servo. Also to note, the new V2 version of this dig does work with all of the Vanquish transmission housings now. The Vanquish transmission housing was updated in 2016 to be a little bit different style, and the original dig, which was out of production by that point, did not work with that new case style. This new version of the dig will work with the old version of the Vanquish case or the new version, as well as the factory axial case that has the bolt-on style motor mount. With those key points covered, let's get into the installation of the dig and show you how this goes together with the transmission. When you get the package from Vanquish, when you open it up, this is what you'll see. The dig comes partially assembled. The parts that are loose, you'll see, will be this rear drive output as well as the rear drive dog. That rear drive dog slides onto that rear output once that rear output is assembled inside of the transmission. The kit also comes with a front output just to give you chromoly outputs on your transmission. The last piece you'll see here is the servo mount. This is for a standard full-size servo. To begin the installation, we need to remove the 4 screws holding the 2 case halves together. Once those 4 screws are removed, you can separate the 2 halves of the transmission. The only thing that we need to work on inside the transmission is that lower final gear. Remove the 3 screws holding the outputs together and retain those screws. Install the new outputs included in the dig kit onto that lower final gear. Apply Loctite to those stock screws that you removed initially. When you're reinstalling the lower gear, make sure that the rear output with the pin is facing rearward and the stock style output is facing forward. Reinstall the top rightmost screw to the case half to hold it together temporarily. Now,
Slide that rear dog onto that rear lower output. Make sure there's a small gap between the case and that dog. A little bit of rubbing would be okay, but you can add a little bit of space and everything should spin much more freely. Now attach the partially assembled rear dig unit and install the 3 screws that hold the dig onto the transmission case. Install the washer onto the small screw that's designed to hold the servo into the servo mount. This just gives you a little extra room to hold everything in place. With your servo installed in the mount, make sure that that servo arm is facing straight up at the neutral point. With the servo installed into the mount, attach the mount to the case with the 2 screws. There's an M4 set screw included in the kit to build your shift linkage with the 2 Traxxas rod ends. Reinstall the drive shafts to the transmission. The rear drive shaft will need to be a shorter version than you had in a stock SCX-10 form.
Now that the transmission and dig assembly is assembled with the drive shafts reattached, there is something again that should be noted. This rear dig assembly does take up distance of that rear drive shaft. So you do need to make sure that you compensate for that with a shorter rear drive line. The nice thing about the axial wildboard drive shafts is that they're plastic and can simply be cut down to length. Take the same amount off of both female ends to make sure that you get plenty of engagement with that male slider piece. It works really well, and the axial wildboard drive shafts are pretty strong. I was previously running MIPs for the SCX-10 in my truck. So rather than buying one of the entire shortened rear dig shafts, I simply replaced just one of the male pieces with a stubby MIP male replacement part, and that way you can get by with a cheap replacement in comparison to a full new rear drive shaft. With that, we're now going to take and install this into the vehicle. Reinstalling this after you've determined your rear drive shaft length is pretty simple. The only tricky part left is setting the endpoints properly on the dig unit. But we need to get it back in the car and get everything spinning so that we can set the drive shafts while the entire drivetrain is spinning, so that you can make sure that everything is seating exactly where it needs to be.
I'm running the Futaba 4PV, and that's what I'll be showing the programming on. The first thing we need to do is go to the sub-trim menu. The sub-trim sets the center point of the channel. What we're going to do here is set this number to set the shifter arm on the dig to be in the centermost position, making sure that that rear drive shaft is completely free to spin without any sort of binding or engagement with the front or rear dogs. The next thing we're going to do is go to the endpoint menu. We're going to go to the channel that's controlling our dig, and we're going to set the endpoints low. I'm going to start at 20% up and down. This just gives us a very narrow amount of adjustment to make sure that we don't overheat the servo initially by trying to push it past its limits. The next thing you need to do is set up a 3-position switch to control the dig. For the Futaba, I'm going to use programmable switch DT2 and set that up as a 3-position switch. If you need help with that on the Futaba side, I'm happy to help. I will be using, like I said, DT2 and setting it to 100 steps in each direction. That is how you program a 3-position switch in a Futaba radio. Depending on what radio you're using, the instructions will definitely differ. Another nice function to have is a 2-position switch. The most used functions of the dig will be 4-wheel drive and locked. Those are at the extents of the servo's throw, forward and backwards. So what I will do is go change PS2 to control my channel 4 and change that to an alternating switch. This will allow me to have that quick lock and quick 4-wheel drive function, which is most used on the trail. Once you have your switches programmed, now you can begin to adjust your endpoints. Begin to apply power from the motor and increase the forward endpoint of your servo until you have an engaged 4-wheel drive. Increase that endpoint until that shifter is at its full forward limit, but not beginning to touch the case or bind the drivetrain. If your servo does begin to bind, it will overheat your servo and risk burning it up, plus adds excess stress to the driveline components. Once you've set the forward endpoint, the rear endpoint will be very similar. However, you will not be able to add power to that driveline with the motor. Instead, you'll have to do it by hand because it will be physically disconnected in the dig unit. You need to make sure that the slide dog is fully locked into the rear dog inside the dig case, just to make sure that you get a nice secure lock function to hold that rear axle while doing the tight turning maneuvers. This video shows my truck here powered up in four-wheel drive, and I will cycle in between the different functions just to show you that this is how the power of the dig unit does transition. You can see me going from four-wheel drive to the locked or freewheel position here. It can shift on the fly pretty smoothly. Of course, that does add excess wear. Here you can see the freewheel position where I can easily rotate that rear axle by hand without hardly any drag. And then right back into four-wheel drive on the fly.
So with that completely installed now, guys, you're ready to go have a completely new type of driving experience than you've ever had if you've never ran dig before. Sure, you guys will enjoy it. I love running it, and I'm glad it's back in the Vanquish lineup. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you on the next one.